Hey guys, welcome to another video on immigration policy. This time we're going to look at immigration policy and how it affects the economic goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. Now to recap what immigration policy is, I'm not going to write this down this time, but immigration policy is the supply side management of the composition and number of migrants entering Australia. So if you guys want to remind yourself what immigration policy is and the different components of immigration policy, I'd encourage you to go through the video on immigration policy. So immigration policy consists of skilled, humanitarian, as well as family migration. The majority of immigration policy, however, lies in skilled migration, so around 70% of immigration is from skilled migration. Strong and sustainable economic growth, on the other hand, is achieved when inflation is kept low, natural resources are not depleted, and thirdly, we have a strong level of GDP growth. That's around 3 to 4% at the moment. So it is the maximum level of GDP growth without the onset of inflation. And inflation should be kept around 2 to 3% CPI per annum over the course of the business cycle. So that's the goal of strong sustainable economic growth. And again, I'd encourage you to go through the video on the goal of strong sustainable economic growth in our government goal sector if you aren't familiar with this concept. Okay, so as we talked about, immigration policy targets two things in our aggregate supply. So aggregate supply being land, labour, capital being our primary factors, as well as efficiency. So by recruiting skilled labour overseas, we improve our efficiency as well as improving our potential labour market. So instead of hiring or recruiting from just a local pool of labour, we can go global and we can hire anyone who is willing to come to Australia and anyone who fits the role that we are looking for. Okay, so how does this affect strong and sustainable economic growth? Well, firstly, by increasing our efficiency and by increasing our labour pool, we can see that our productive potential in fact increases. So as we talked about in our video on aggregate supply and immigration policy, the aggregate supply line in fact increases from AS1 to AS2. If you guys want to look at the reasoning behind this and reasoning why labour and efficiency improvements can increase aggregate supply, I'd encourage you again to look at the video on immigration policy and aggregate supply. But as we can see, if aggregate demand stays constant, or let's assume for the sake of making this a little bit more realistic, because we have more people in the economy, the aggregate demand in fact also increases by a little margin, aggregate demand 2. We will see that the initial equilibrium in this economy is at pi 1 and y 1. Let's call this 3% and let's call this 3% as well. So they're both within the target ranges. However, our new equilibrium, which is here, we can see that the inflation rate is around, let's call this 2.7% for simplicity. However, y has increased to around 5%. So although this is not within the target, we can see that inflation is not compromised, and there is actually no set target. So ignore that I've called this a target, but it is generally what the government tries to fix around, because that is through historical trends the level of economic growth that corresponds to around 2 to 3% CPI. But as we can see, if the economic growth rate reaches 5% and inflation is still within this 2 to 3% band, that is still good for the economy and is still considered a strong level of economic growth or GDP growth. So as a result, we can see that when aggregate supply shifts to the right, because our labour resources have increased, and because our efficiency in utilising labour and capital has increased, and therefore our domestic production also increases from 3% to 5% here. So that is good in the sense that inflation is kept in check because of this idea that real unit labour costs are kept down. So cost inflation has in fact eased. So we've looked at one part of this argument of how immigration policy can in fact encourage strong sustainable economic growth. But there is always another side. And if we come back to our lecture on immigration policy and inflation, we can see that although cost inflation has eased through this decrease in real unit labour costs because of this larger pool of labour, we will also see that demand inflation can also increase because as people migrate to Australia, then they would actually increase the demand for food, transport, dwellings, residence, and clothes, and anything. So as the population size increases, demand inflation or aggregate demand may increase. And if this increases above our aggregate supply, then we would experience demand inflation. So we're going to look at the other side of the argument now of how immigration policy can actually lead to an unsustainable rate of growth. So what does that actually mean? It means that when immigration, and although immigration can expand our aggregate supply or productive capacity potential, it also has an effect of creating this rapidly, I'm just going to put this ad here, rapidly growing population. And with a rapidly growing population, we can see that this could add to resource depletion. Since Australia is such a large country, everyone requires cars to transport themselves from A to B. However, with a larger population, that means a more dependency or higher dependency for cars and therefore petrol. And therefore we're consuming more fuel, we're consuming more electricity, consuming more water, and that would be detrimental to our our preservation of natural resources. So rapidly growing population results in resource depletion, urban congestion, waste disposal or greater waste disposal, and more CO2 emissions. So although we can see that a larger population creates a larger labour force, it can in fact be detrimental to this achievement of intertemporal efficiency. So when I talk about efficiency here, we're focused on technical or productive efficiency. However, immigration policy may in fact have an adverse effect to intertemporal efficiency. So although there may be a strong level of economic growth, there may be inflation may be kept low due to lower real unit labour costs. However, we must also consider the adverse effects it may have on our natural resources when we have a very, very large population, and how that large population can deplete our natural resources for the use of future generations. So that's the double-edged sword of immigration policy. Although it can achieve strong economic growth, the strong economic growth may not be sustainable in the long run, even if we are improving efficiency and even if we are increasing our labour potential, because of the fact that having more people may deplete more natural resources.